It's around 118 CE, and you're standing at a public fountain in the middle of Rome, watching water pour out of a carved lion's mouth in a constant, unbroken stream. It has been running like this non-stop day and night for as long as anyone alive can remember, and it will keep running long after you're dead. You didn't dig a well for it. You didn't carry it from a river. It arrived here, cold and clean, having traveled possibly 60 kilometers through stone channels, tunnels cut through hillsides, and arched bridges taller than any building you'll ever stand in, dropping in height by a few centimeters every 100 meters the entire way, so gently that the water never even realized it was being led. A city of over 1 million people is drinking, bathing, and flushing its waste with a supply of water more reliable than most of the world would have again until the 20th century. And you're not impressed by it. You've never known anything else. Here's the thing nobody pictures when they think about ancient Rome and water. We picture the aqueducts, sure, the postcard image, the big stone arches marching across a field in the countryside. What we don't picture is the actual, unglamorous problem sitting underneath that image. How do you keep over 1 million people alive, hydrated, and not dying of dysentery in a city with no natural spring big enough to support them, built next to a river so polluted with sewage that drinking straight from it was practically an invitation to an early grave? Because that's the real achievement. Anyone can build an arch. Keeping an entire capital city alive on borrowed water for 500 years without the whole system collapsing. That's the hard part. So today we're going through all of it. The aqueducts, the lead pipes, the wine, the soldiers on campaign with none of this infrastructure at all. And by the end you're going to realize something slightly uncomfortable. Rome solved the water problem so well in some ways and so catastrophically badly in one specific way that the two facts sit right next to each other in the same system. Let's go. The misconception is thinking Rome solved water with one invention, the aqueduct, and stopped there. Didn't. The aqueduct was the beginning of the problem, not the end of it. Getting water to the edge of the city was the easy part, comparatively. The actual engineering challenge was distribution, filtration, and figuring out which uses got which quality of water, because Rome very quickly ran into a problem every growing city eventually hits. There's never quite enough clean water for everyone to have as much as they want, so someone has to decide who gets it first. Start with the aqueducts themselves, because the engineering is worth sitting with. Rome eventually ran 11 of them, the first completed around 312 BCE, feeding the city from sources dozens of kilometers away. Most of an aqueduct's length wasn't the dramatic stone arches you picture. That was reserved for crossing valleys. Most of it ran underground in stone or concrete channels, buried specifically to keep the water cool, clean, and protected from contamination or sabotage. The entire system relied on gravity alone. Roman engineers calculated a gradient so precise that water dropped only a handful of centimeters over an entire kilometer, consistently, for tens of kilometers at a stretch, using nothing but eyesight, a device called a chorobates for leveling, and an enormous amount of trial and error passed down through generations of surveyors. Get the slope wrong and water either stagnates and turns foul, or it moves so fast it erodes the channel apart. They got it right often enough to run some of these systems for centuries. Once the water reached the city, it hit a distribution network built around a device called the castellum divisorium, a distribution tank that split the incoming flow into different pipes for different purposes, and Rome ranked those purposes explicitly. Public fountains and baths got priority. Private citizens with the money and connections to tap into the supply for their own homes came next, and they paid for it, sometimes through bribery of the water officials as much as official channels. Industrial and agricultural uses came last. This wasn't an accident, it was policy, written down by officials like Sextus Julius Frontinus, who ran Rome's water commission around 97 CE and left behind a genuinely detailed account of the entire system, pipe sizes, legal penalties for illegal taps, the works. A bureaucrat's memo turned out to be one of the best surviving windows we have into how an entire ancient city actually functioned. Now here's the part that should make you slightly uneasy. Distribution within the city ran through pipes, and the pipes were very often lead. Lead was cheap, workable, easy to solder, and resistant to corrosion in a way that made it the obvious engineering choice, and Roman writers were not entirely oblivious to the risk. The architect Vitruvius wrote explicitly that water carried through lead pipes seemed less healthy than water carried through clay, and recommended clay pipes instead. Nobody listened at scale because lead pipes were simply better infrastructure by every practical measure except the one that mattered long-term. The counterargument that's kept this debate alive among historians for a century is that Roman water moved constantly and was heavily mineralized, which tends to build up a protective limescale coating inside the pipes fairly quickly, meaning the water itself may have had less direct contact with bare lead than you'd assume, and Rome's water was famously described by contemporaries as tasting sweet and clean, not metallic. So the honest answer, the one modern researchers still argue about, is that lead exposure in Roman Rome was almost certainly real and almost certainly worse for wealthy households with the most private plumbing, but probably far more gradual and complicated than the popular idea that lead pipes single-handedly poisoned an empire. It's a genuinely unresolved question, and that uncertainty is more interesting than a clean answer would be. Move away from the pipes and into what people actually drank, because straight water wasn't always the plan even when it was available. Roman soldiers on campaign, far from any aqueduct, relied on a drink called pasca, water mixed with sour wine vinegar, sometimes with herbs added. It wasn't a treat, it was standard-issue military ration, and the vinegar served a real practical function. Acidic liquid is measurably more hostile to a lot of waterborne pathogens than plain water from an unknown source, and it also made questionable water at least drinkable by cutting the taste of whatever was actually in it. Civilians did a version of this too, watering down wine for everyday drinking rather than drinking it undiluted, partly for the alcohol content, but also because wine's acidity and alcohol both made it a genuinely safer base for water of uncertain quality than water alone. Away from the capital, on the frontier, in a marching camp, none of the aqueduct system existed at all, and Roman military engineering had to solve the water problem from scratch. Fast, every single time a legion set up camp. Legionary camps were built, whenever possible, near a river or stream, but soldiers also dug wells inside the camp defenses as a matter of standard procedure, specifically so the camp wouldn't have to send men outside the walls under threat of ambush just to fetch water. Roman military manuals treat water access as a tactical consideration on the same level as high ground or a defensible perimeter, because an army that runs out of water stops being an army within about 3 days, faster in the wrong climate. Wells, cisterns to catch rainwater, and strict water discipline, meaning water carried on the march in leather or wooden containers and rationed rather than freely available, kept tens of thousands of men functioning in places with no permanent infrastructure at all. And then there's the sewer, because you cannot talk about Rome's relationship with water without talking about where it went afterward. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, started as an open drainage channel centuries before the aqueducts and was gradually covered over and expanded into a genuine underground sewer system, carrying wastewater and runoff away from the city and out into the Tiber. Public latrines connected directly into it, and public baths used their overflow to flush the system, meaning the water that had just been used for bathing and toilets got reused one more time as flushing power before finally leaving the city. It's not glamorous, but it's the same principle behind every modern sewage system, and Rome was running some version of it for over 2,000 years. Parts of the Cloaca Maxima are still functioning today. Here's where the story turns over. We've been treating clean water as something Rome achieved and solved, full stop, engineering triumph, end of chapter. But sit with the actual shape of the system for a second. The cleanest, most reliable water in the ancient world was flowing constantly, day and night, mostly toward public fountains, baths, and the homes of people who could afford a private connection, while the poorest residents of Rome, crammed into multi-story apartment blocks called insulae with no plumbing at all, still had to walk to a public fountain and carry every drop home in a jug, exactly like people in cities with no aqueduct whatsoever. The infrastructure existed, the engineering was solved, but access to it was never actually equal, and in some cases the very people wealthy enough to have water piped directly into their homes were quietly the ones most exposed to whatever risk the lead pipes carried. Rome built one of the most sophisticated water systems in human history and still couldn't fully escape the oldest problem in any city, that clean water tends to flow first toward the people who already have the most. So picture it again, that fountain, the water pouring endlessly out of stone, cold and constant, and think about everyone standing around it with a jug in their hands, people who'd never once had to think about where water came from because an empire's worth of surveying, tunneling, and gravity had already solved that question for them, generations before they were born. It took engineers who never met each other, working across centuries, to keep that fountain running, and it took a soldier on a frontier with nothing but a shovel and a well to keep an army alive somewhere that fountain's water would never reach. So, question for you, no taps, no filters, just an aqueduct, a fountain, and a jug you carry yourself. Could you have kept yourself alive on Roman water? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.